and by the time she could, it was already too late. 10th August 2010. It was early, just after sunrise. The sky was clear, the harbor still. August in Charleston carries a heat that creeps in slowly, the kind that doesn't announce itself until you're already sweating. At exactly 6:40 a.m., Malcolm untied the ropes, started the engine, and pulled away from the dock with Ayanna seated near the front of the boat, wearing a gray hoodie over a bathing suit. She waved once to no one in particular, and they disappeared around the bend. Charlene was still in her robe when they left. She had walked them to the edge of the porch, kissed Ayanna on the forehead, and reminded Malcolm to check in before dark. He gave his usual half-smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes, and promised they'd be back by Sunday evening. It was nothing unusual. They'd taken this exact trip at least 6 times in the past year. It had become routine. The forecast was calm. No storms in the area, no red flags on the weather station. Charlene spent most of Friday cleaning the house, folding laundry, preparing the pot roast Ayanna liked. She planned to freeze it for Sunday night so they could come home, shower, and eat as a family. Saturday came and went without a call. She wasn't alarmed. Malcolm often went out of signal range when sailing, and Ayanna had never been one to check in constantly. She just assumed they were out on the water fishing or reading. She even joked to herself that Malcolm was probably making Ayanna learn to navigate by the stars again, just to build character. But by Sunday night, the mood changed. The sun went down. No headlights appeared in the driveway. Charlene tried Malcolm's phone. No answer. Straight to voicemail. Then she tried Ayanna's. Same result. Still, she told herself to wait. Maybe they had engine trouble. Maybe they'd pulled into a small dock for the night. She made up excuses. She reheated dinner and left it covered on the stove. She didn't sleep. By 4:30 a.m. on Monday, she called the Coast Guard. At 6:12 a.m., a private fishing charter reported seeing an unmanned boat drifting roughly 12 miles offshore. The Coast Guard dispatched a search vessel. By 7:18 a.m., they confirmed the boat's registration, Charleston Dock Permit number 8823, Malcolm's. The vessel was intact. No visible damage. The engine was still running at idle speed. The cooler was full. Sandwiches, water bottles, 2 apples, a jar of peanut butter. Ayanna's purple flip-flops were tucked beneath the front seat. A pair of sunglasses rested on the control panel. The radio was functional. The emergency beacon untouched. Life jackets gone. There was no blood, no overturned equipment, no notes, no signs of a struggle, only absence. Charlene was notified just before 9 a.m. They brought her in to ask questions. What were they wearing? Did either of them know how to swim? Had either of them mentioned feeling unwell? She answered everything clearly. She didn't cry, not yet. Her mind was too focused, too sharp. She just kept repeating that Malcolm was a strong sailor. He wouldn't take risks. Ayanna wore a life jacket every time. Every time. The official search began that afternoon. Boats, helicopters, divers. Over the next 3 days, the area was combed by professionals and volunteers. Nothing turned up. No bodies, no debris, not even a shoe. The boat had simply come back, but they hadn't. Reporters showed up outside Charlene's home. A few headlines ran with phrases like father-daughter tragedy and ocean mystery, but there was nothing for them to photograph. No funeral, no crash site, just a woman sitting on her front porch with the porch light on well past midnight. Friends brought food, neighbors left flowers, church members offered prayers, but Charlene stayed silent. She stared at the end of the driveway, waiting for something to return, waiting for a knock on the door, waiting for someone to admit it was a mistake, that they were just lost, that they had been found. But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Eventually, the Coast Guard suspended the search. The case was marked presumed lost at sea, and with that, it was over officially, but not for Charlene. Because something about it never sat right. The boat hadn't been damaged. The supplies hadn't been used. There had been no radio call, no flare, no message in a bottle, no signs of panic. It was like they'd simply left, slipped out of the world without a ripple. And that kind of exit didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a choice. The search stretched across 11 days. Helicopters circled open water from sunrise to sundown. Coast Guard vessels dragged sonar equipment over every square mile. Civilian volunteers launched kayaks. Drones were flown. Dive teams scoured the surrounding reefs. Nothing came back. Not a body, not a shoe, not even a scrap of clothing. It was as if the ocean had taken them whole, without sound, without struggle, without mercy. Detective Julius Dean was assigned to the case on the fourth day. He was methodical, level-headed, the kind of investigator who asked more questions than he answered. He pulled Malcolm's records, both military and civilian. Navy career, clean. 20 years served, multiple commendations, no disciplinary actions, no psych evaluations, no court-martials, nothing that would suggest recklessness, trauma, or instability. He checked Malcolm's bank accounts. No suspicious withdrawals, no new credit cards, no sudden disappearances of funds, no insurance policies were recently updated. Life insurance had been minimal and not paid out. He searched the home. No signs of distress, no notes left behind. Malcolm's personal computer showed regular usage, weather updates, boat maintenance forums, even an email to a former Navy buddy dated just 2 days before the trip talking about engine noise on the port side. There were no journal entries, no flagged behavior, no documented mental health history. His last cell phone ping came from within 5 miles of the launch site. After that, radio silence. Charlene filed the missing persons report herself, even though by that time the Coast Guard had already begun assembling the official incident file. She brought photos, dental records, childhood marks Ayana had on her left shoulder. She kept hoping someone would ask something new, something that would crack things open. But every question led to the same dead end. She sat through 5 interviews, gave them passwords, signed off on document releases. She stayed composed, sharp, relentless. The grief hadn't settled in yet. The disbelief was still taking up too much space. The media picked up the story by the end of the first week. Local newspapers ran a front-page headline, "Father and daughter vanish at sea. Questions, but no clues." A few anchors called it a tragedy. Some referred to it as a freak accident. None of them had any answers. Malcolm was painted as a decorated veteran, a devoted father figure, respected in the marina community. Ayana was described as a brilliant student with a bright future, mature beyond her years, and deeply loved. The town mourned them publicly. Candlelight vigils were held at the pier. Her school placed a memorial bench near the science wing, and her 8th grade English teacher wrote a tribute piece for the local paper titled, "She Belonged to the Ocean." But behind closed doors, the silence started to change. Neighbors started speaking in half sentences. There were murmurs about how close they had become, about how Ayana never really had friends over, about how she always looked at him first before answering questions in public. A friend of Charlene's once asked quietly, "Did you ever think maybe she didn't finish the sentence?" Charlene didn't let her because Charlene still had faith in Malcolm, in Ayana, in God. She refused to believe that the people she loved most could choose to leave her like that. 6 months passed. The search was called off, with no evidence of foul play, no bodies recovered, and no further sightings. The state granted the legal process of declaration. On February 5, 2011, Malcolm Bennett and Ayana Carter Bennett were officially declared dead, presumed drowned in open water. It felt like watching them be buried twice. Once by the ocean, again by paper. Charlene signed the documents with a steady hand. She didn't cry in the courtroom, but when she got home, she folded Malcolm's clothes into a box and put them in the attic. She left Ayana's room untouched. Friends told her to heal. Church friends told her to forgive. Her therapist told her to accept the unexplainable. But something deep inside her held back. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't tell anyone, but every time she sat still long enough, every time she closed her eyes for longer than a few seconds, she saw that boat again, floating, perfect, abandoned. She knew accidents happened. She knew the ocean could be cruel, but this didn't feel like that. This felt like someone had made a decision and walked away from her without ever turning back. Charlene left their bedroom exactly as it was, not out of hope, and not because she was in denial, but because changing anything felt disrespectful to what she had lost. Malcolm's boots stayed by the door. His razor sat untouched beside the sink. The left side of the bed remained made undisturbed for 12 years. She changed the sheets every few weeks, but never laid on his pillow, never moved his watch from the nightstand. Even when dust began to settle over the headboard and sunlight faded the color of the curtains, she kept it as it was. a room frozen in time. She tried grief counseling at the insistence of her pastor. She sat in small circles with other women who had buried husbands to cancer or children to car accidents. They shared memories, they talked about healing, but Charlene never spoke much because no one else in the room had gone through what she had. Their grief had explanations. Theirs came with funerals, with caskets, with autopsy reports. Hers came with a drifting boat and 1,000 unanswered questions. She nodded politely, smiled where expected, and walked back into silence every night. She never remarried, not because there weren't offers, there were, but because she didn't want to start over. Not with someone who would ask questions about Ayana, not with someone who would touch her without understanding the weight of the last person who had. She wore her wedding ring for years, even after the declaration of death. Eventually, she moved it to a chain around her neck. Every August 5th, she lit a single candle and placed it in the window. No words, no ceremonies, just a quiet flame for two people who had disappeared without a goodbye. The first few years, neighbors joined her. One brought flowers, another brought tea. By year 6, only the candle remained. Ayana's friends moved on. Some out of state, some to college, some into marriages of their own. One of them, Marissa Caldwell, sent Charlene a letter 7 years after the disappearance. The handwriting was careful, the wording cautious. We never knew how to say it, but we always thought it was weird, the way she clung to him. She looked at him differently, like he was the only person in the room. It didn't feel like a normal father-daughter thing, but we figured we were reading into it. We told ourselves we were just being petty. I'm sorry we didn't speak sooner. Charlene folded the letter once, then again. She didn't throw it away, but she didn't answer it either. Some truths arrive late on purpose, and by the time they do, they serve no purpose at all. Financially, things got harder. The life insurance policy on Malcolm was modest, $25,000, but because the case had never been fully closed and no bodies were recovered, the insurance company labeled it as a high-risk, unresolved disappearance. Payment was suspended indefinitely, pending further proof of death. Charlene appealed twice, hired a lawyer. The paperwork dragged for years and ultimately led nowhere. The mortgage fell behind by year 4. She sold her car, then the small boat Malcolm had once taught Ayana to steer. By year 5, she was working 2 jobs, counselor by day, office cleaning by night. She told herself it was temporary, just until things balanced out, but nothing ever really did. Her faith became fractured, not gone, but dimmed. She still went to church, still stood for the hymns, still bowed her head. But something had shifted, something quiet. She couldn't pray for comfort anymore because she didn't know what she was mourning. She wasn't grieving death. She was grieving the hole left behind when 2 people vanish and take your whole life with them. There were moments where she convinced herself it was all just misfortune, that maybe the ocean had pulled them under gently, that maybe their bodies had drifted far enough out to never return. But every time she stood at the shoreline looking out past the dock where they launched that final morning, she couldn't shake what had lived in her gut since day 1. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't nature. This was chosen. And whoever made that choice had never looked back. Charlene didn't just lose her family. She lost her place in the story they had all built together, and in its absence, she was left with something far more difficult to carry: doubt. May 7th, 2022. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when Charlene's phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a message from Sandra Logan, her friend since college, someone who traveled often and sent the kind of cheerful updates that never needed replies. This time it was a video, no caption, no context, just a 26-second clip forwarded with a casual note. "This festival is wild, you'd love it here." Charlene tapped it open without thinking. It opened to bright music, shaky camera movement, and the kind of colors that almost looked too warm to be real. There were people everywhere, locals spinning each other in fast circles, tourists clapping, children chasing bubbles as they floated upward into tangled streamers strung across palm trees. It looked like joy, the kind she hadn't felt in a long time. Then around the 10th second, the camera tilted slightly to the right, and that's when everything stopped. In the background, blurry but visible, a man and a woman were dancing closely. The man had one arm wrapped around the woman's waist, She leaned in as they turned. They laughed together, heads tilted close. It was a small moment, ordinary. It should have been nothing. But Charlene's hand froze over the screen. Something deep in her chest locked up. She watched the clip again, then again. She didn't blink. The man was older than she remembered, heavier in the shoulders, a thick gray beard covering the jawline she once kissed. But the way he stood, the rhythm of his body, the half smile tucked into his cheek, it was Malcolm. And the woman beside him. She was no longer the slim 16-year-old Charlene kissed goodbye on a dock 12 years ago, but she had the same frame, the same neck tilt, the same expression when she laughed. It was Ayanna. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't uncertainty. It was immediate and clear. That was her daughter. That was her husband, alive. She didn't scream. She didn't call Sandra. She didn't even speak. She just sat at the table and watched it again and again. She took screenshots and zoomed in until the pixels broke apart. But even when the image blurred, the truth didn't. She knew them. Not as they looked, as they moved, as they existed together. Charlene whispered it to herself under her breath. That's them. Her hand didn't shake. Her eyes didn't well up. This wasn't the kind of heartbreak that needed confirmation. It was the kind that lands without warning because it had been waiting for years to arrive. She thought about the bedroom she kept untouched. She thought about the candle she lit every August. She thought about every prayer, every appointment, every box she never unpacked. And now 26 seconds had unraveled all of it. They hadn't drowned. They hadn't been taken. They had chosen to leave. And not just to leave, but to build something new together. That moment didn't just break her. It redefined everything she had lived through. The silence, the emptiness, the legal declarations, the frozen life. None of it was grief for the dead. It had been grief for people who were still alive. People who had not only survived, but moved on without her. Charlene played the clip one more time, and this time she didn't stop it when they laughed. She let it play. She memorized it. Charlene tried to forget. That was her first instinct. She told herself maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe grief had tricked her eyes and layered her memories over strangers' faces. She muted the video, then deleted it, then pulled it back from her phone's trash folder an hour later and watched it again. Each time the denial thinned until there was nothing left to lean on. For the next days, she went through the motions, woke up at the same time, showered, went to work, made small talk with coworkers, laughed when she had to, but something had changed and she could feel it in her bones. Her body moved, but her mind stayed in Ecuador. At night, she laid in bed and stared at the ceiling. The same ceiling that Malcolm had once painted over when the roof leaked. The same ceiling they used to joke about replacing when they retired. Now it just looked unfamiliar, like she was lying under someone else's life. She thought maybe time would dull it, that after enough nights of exhaustion, the memory would fade or lose its edge, but it didn't. It stayed sharp. The more she tried to forget, the more vivid it became. And with every passing hour, a new thought crept in, not just about what they had done, but how long it must have been going on. She started reviewing everything all over again. The long boat rides, the excuses, the locked doors, the way Ayanna's eyes would shift toward Malcolm whenever Charlene asked a question. The journal entry she found years ago. The sea feels safer than land. None of it felt like teenage mood swings anymore. It felt like evidence. She opened the drawer where she kept the letter from Ayanna's friend. The one that said, "We always thought it was weird the way she clung to him." She unfolded it, read it 5 times, and didn't put it back. She booked the flight with shaking fingers. One way, Charleston to Cato, then a bus route to the coastal village where Sandra had taken the video. She didn't call Sandra. She didn't tell her church friends. She didn't notify her cousin or her supervisor. For the first time in 12 years, she did something without explaining herself to anyone. She packed light, just enough for a week. She withdrew cash. She printed a still image from the video and folded it into her wallet. She didn't look at herself in the mirror before leaving. She already knew what she looked like, a woman who had survived a death that never happened. Charlene had always believed that pain had limits, that once you crossed a certain threshold, the worst was behind you. But now she understood that some wounds don't scab. They stay open just beneath the skin, waiting for one moment, one image to tear them wide again. And this wasn't about getting answers anymore. This was about standing in front of the people who ended her life while continuing to live theirs and deciding finally what to do about it. Charlene boarded her flight on May 21st, 2022, just before dawn. She arrived early, not because of airport rush, but because she didn't want to hesitate. She brought only what she could carry, a mid-size bag with 4 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a small notepad, and the single blurry screenshot she had printed from the video. She left her phone in airplane mode. She didn't text her cousin. She didn't call her pastor. She left her front porch light on like she had done every night for the past 12 years. And this time, she walked away from it with no intention of returning the same. The flight from Charleston to Miami was short. The one from Miami to Quito was harder, almost 5 hours, most of it spent in silence. The man next to her fell asleep with his arms crossed. A child kicked the back of her seat for 20 minutes straight. She didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon outside the window, but her mind was nowhere near the clouds. It was already in Ecuador, on a side street she had never walked, in a house she had never entered, with 2 faces she had buried long ago, who somehow had come back to life in the most unforgivable way. In Quito, she moved quickly. No photos, no distractions. She asked for the bus terminal in broken Spanish and bought a ticket on the next route heading to the western coast. It was a long, winding trip through uneven roads, past villages with metal rooftops and painted churches, the kind of landscape that made time feel unfamiliar. The bus was hot, cramped, locals dozed off in the sunlit window seats. Vendors passed through the aisles selling bottled water and boiled eggs in plastic bags. Charlene didn't eat. She just gripped her notebook and watched the road disappear behind her. She arrived in the coastal town just after 7 p.m. It wasn't what she expected. The streets were cleaner, the pace was slower. The smell of salt water carried through every open doorway. This wasn't a tourist spot. This was a place people vanished to, not in. She found a cheap motel along the edge of the village, peeling white paint, rusted hinges, a fan that buzzed louder than it cooled, and handed the clerk cash for 2 nights without giving her real name. Then she walked. She didn't have an address, only the background details from a 26-second video clip. Red paper lanterns strung across rooftops, a small bakery with blue shutters, a pink wall covered in chipped graffiti. She followed the images like coordinates. It took her a day and a half, but she found it. A modest yellow house with a leaning wooden gate and 2 hammocks tied to the porch. She didn't knock, she didn't go near it, she just watched. From across the street, hidden behind her sunglasses and a thin veil of passing tourists, she began tracking everything. His name here was Miguel. Hers was Rosa. Everyone in the neighborhood knew them, but barely. They weren't social. They didn't host parties. They shopped in the morning, walked together most evenings, and kept their conversation short. People described them as polite, private, and peaceful. They had moved there about 10 years ago. No children, no drama, no reason to ask questions. Ayana or Rosa taught English to local school children on the patio behind a tiny cafe near the beach. She was fluent, graceful, well-liked by the families. She spoke with confidence, smiled easily, but her laughter was different now, sharper, more deliberate, as if rehearsed. Charlene noticed that when she laughed, she always glanced at Malcolm first, like she was still waiting for permission to feel anything. Malcolm, or Miguel, worked with boats. Nothing official, just off-the-books work on motors and busted rudders in exchange for food or cash. He still wore his ball cap backward, still moved like a man who thought before he stepped. He shook hands with fishermen like an equal, but never shared too much. They knew him as someone who kept to himself. A helpful neighbor, the kind of man who left no ripples. Charlene wrote down every detail, what time they left the house, which streets they avoided, how long they stayed in the market, what they ate, how they looked at each other when no one else was watching. She watched them hold hands. She saw Ayana rest her head on Malcolm's shoulder during a walk along the beach, and one morning, just past 10 a.m., She watched him kiss her on the side of the mouth as she handed him a small glass of juice. Her stomach turned, but she didn't move. For 4 days, she watched them live. And on the 4th day, she watched Diana walk barefoot into the surf, skirt hitched above her knees, silver ring catching the sunlight, hair pulled into a tight bun. She walked beside Malcolm. They stood with their feet in the water. The way he reached for her hand wasn't tender, it was territorial. And in that moment, Charlene stopped thinking of her as a daughter. Because daughters don't wear rings for their fathers. They don't hold them like that. They don't run away and reappear with new names and no shame. They weren't father and daughter anymore. They were something else. Something that had stolen her child, her years, her purpose, her identity. Something that had buried her in her own house, in her own silence while they started over in the sun. And for the first time since August 5th, 2010, Charlene Carter didn't feel lost. She felt ready. It happened on a Wednesday. The sky was bright. The air smelled like grilled plantains and diesel smoke. Charlene had followed them into the town square, staying several paces behind, moving carefully through the narrow crowd. They were walking hand in hand, laughing at something she couldn't hear, moving without urgency like a couple who had long stopped looking over their shoulders. Ayana wore a cotton dress and open-toed sandals. Malcolm had on the same faded cap he used to wear back in Charleston, flipped backward like time hadn't touched him. They stopped in front of a small corner shop that sold canned goods and dried meats. As Ayana leaned toward the window to point at something, Malcolm turned, placed his hand gently at the side of her neck, and kissed her full on the lips. Charlene didn't breathe. There was no space left in her chest for air, no room for thoughts to pass through clean. Everything went still inside her, except for the knowing. There, in the middle of a sunlit village square, he kissed the child she raised as if nothing about it was shameful. As if this was life as it should have been, as if he had earned it. Her arms wrapped around his neck like they had done this hundreds of times. And maybe they had. She didn't cry. There were no more tears left in her for this version of the truth. She turned away slowly and walked back to the motel like someone heading to a funeral where they already knew the ending. Inside her room, she sat on the bed for a long time. No lights, no fan, just the sound of the village moving on the other side of her walls. The decision didn't come with fireworks. It came in quiet. It came like breath. She took out her notebook, tore out a sheet, wrote slowly. They weren't taken from me. They chose each other. And they let me mourn them. They let me believe the sea swallowed them. For 12 years, I lit candles for ghosts. But they weren't dead. They were just gone with each other. I don't know what this makes me, but I know what it makes them. She folded the paper in half and left it under the ceramic water pitcher beside the bed. The pistol came from a man who sold parts out of the back of a fishing truck near the beach. It cost her $180 in cash and an additional $20 for bullets. He didn't ask for ID. She didn't offer a name. He wrapped it in a cloth bag and handed it to her like it was nothing more than fruit or bread. She slipped it into her tote bag, nodded once, and walked away without looking back. She returned to the motel, locked the door, and stared at the ceiling for the rest of the afternoon. She didn't fantasize. She didn't rehearse what she would say. This wasn't about words. Words had failed her. The explanations had come too late. The grief had curdled into something else, something with shape and direction and weight. She waited until the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the streets, until the noise died down and the market stalls began to close. She waited until she knew they'd be home. They were creatures of routine, always back before dark, always together. At 7:32 p.m., she stood up, tucked the gun into her waistband, and left the room without locking the door behind her. She didn't leave to start a confrontation. She left to end something because for 12 years she thought she had lost them. But the truth was far worse. They had abandoned her and chosen each other. The sun was dipping low behind the treetops when they stepped out of the yellow house. May 30th, 2022, 7:43 p.m. The air was thick with humidity. The streets had emptied, save for a few lingering children kicking a flat soccer ball near the corner and the faint clatter of a dish being rinsed 2 doors down. Everything about the moment looked ordinary, except Charlene was already waiting. She stood on the opposite side of the narrow street, back pressed against a weathered wall, one hand resting inside her bag. She had been there for nearly 40 minutes, watching, breathing, repeating their names in her head, not as they were now, as they had been. Her husband, her daughter, her family, before everything had been twisted, rewritten, and stolen. When they emerged, laughing quietly, Charlene stepped forward. Ayana saw her first. She stopped mid-step, her lips parted in confusion, the plastic grocery bag in her hand swaying slightly. Malcolm followed her gaze and turned his head. And when his eyes met Charlene's, his face dropped, not in shock, but something closer to disbelief. He blinked as if trying to clear an illusion. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. Charlene stepped into the street, slow and steady, eyes locked on them. Ayana's voice cracked the silence. "Mom." Charlene didn't answer right away. She stopped just 6 feet away. Her face was unreadable. Her voice, when it came, was low, controlled. "So it was true," she said. "You didn't drown. You didn't die. You just left." Malcolm opened his mouth, started to speak, but Charlene cut him off. Don't you dare explain this to me." Ayana took a step forward, trembling, but her voice shook. "We didn't mean to hurt you. You didn't mean to hurt me," Charlene snapped, her tone still even but sharp. "You let me grieve you. You let me bury 2 people who were alive. You let me sit in that house for 12 years with your photos on the wall and candles on the table. You let me live like a widow, like a mother without a child." Malcolm raised his hand slightly. "Charlene, listen." "No," she interrupted, now facing him directly. "You were supposed to protect her. You were supposed to protect me, and you turned her into your partner." Her voice cracked on the last word. "You called yourself a father, but you waited until I looked away, and then you took her." Ayana's eyes welled with tears. "It wasn't like that. You don't know. I know exactly what it was," Charlene snapped, eyes locking on her. "You were 16. He was 52. Don't rewrite it for him. Don't protect him now. You don't owe him that." Malcolm stepped forward. "You need to calm down." Charlene pulled the pistol from her bag. That single movement made the entire street freeze. The children in the distance stopped playing. A woman watching from her porch dropped her glass. The evening went quiet again, but this time it was heavy. Charlene didn't raise the gun. Not yet. She just held it loosely at her side. "You left me with a house full of ghosts. And now you're standing here like nothing happened. You even changed your names. Miguel and Rosa. Were you pretending the whole time?" Malcolm's face hardened. "Put that down." "Why?" she said, looking between them. "You had your peace. You had each other. You danced in the streets while I was lighting candles back home." She looked directly at Ayana. "I gave you everything. You were my whole world, and you chose him." Ayana opened her mouth, but the words never came out, and then the weight of silence gave way to something final. Charlene raised the pistol. Malcolm lunged. Instinct or guilt, no one will ever know. But the shot hit him before his feet left the ground. He dropped fast, his body hitting the cobblestones with a thud that echoed down the narrow street. Ayana screamed, not out of fear, but from somewhere deeper, anguish, panic, something that had no clear name. She dropped to her knees beside him, crying out, "No, no, no, please." Charlene stepped forward, eyes filled with tears, but her hand unwavering. "You already buried me, Ayana." The second shot rang out. Ayana collapsed beside him. People screamed. Someone ducked behind a bicycle stand. A man shouted for the police. Feet scrambled in every direction. Doors slammed shut. Windows were yanked closed. But Charlene didn't move. She stood over them, silent, the gun still warm in her hand. By the time the local police arrived minutes later, she had placed the pistol gently on the ground, stepped back, and stood still with her hands at her sides. Her face was calm. Her voice never returned. She said nothing because what needed to be said had already been done. Justice is a word for the living, but what do you call it when the dead come back to finish the story? The arrest happened quickly, but nothing about it felt rushed. Charlene didn't run. She didn't flinch when the first squad car turned the corner or when officers shouted in Spanish for her to raise her hands. She simply stepped away from the bodies, placed the pistol on the edge of the sidewalk, and held her palms in the air like she had been expecting this moment for years. The locals had already begun to form a half circle of stunned faces behind the yellow house. Neighbors who had once waved at Miguel and Rosa from their porches now stood frozen, some whispering, others weeping. The bodies of Malcolm and Ayanna lay crumpled beside a tipped-over tote bag and a single cracked mango that had rolled into the gutter. Police approached Charlene with care as if unsure whether she might reach for the gun again, but she didn't. She didn't speak. She didn't resist. She let them guide her down onto the stone path, her knees brushing against a smear of blood that used to belong to the man she once called her husband. They read her rights. She nodded along. She didn't ask questions. She didn't argue. And when one of the officers asked her name, she said, "Charlene Marie Carter, I'm the mother." They put her in the back of the patrol truck with the sirens off. No lights, just a slow crawl through the narrow streets of the coastal town she had arrived in 12 days earlier as a quiet, unassuming tourist. Now she was being taken out as a confessed killer. At the precinct, Charlene was booked without incident. No signs of mental instability, no intoxication. Her possessions were bagged. $27 in US currency, a motel key, a faded photograph of Ayanna in middle school, and a folded letter sealed but unaddressed. She had written it the night before. They never opened it. She was placed in a holding cell that night. Concrete walls, a thin cot, no windows. She sat on the edge of the bed for hours, still in the same skirt she wore during the shooting, speckled with dried blood around the hem. When an officer brought her water, she accepted it with a quiet thank you. When he asked if she needed a doctor, she said no. The next morning, she asked to speak with an officer in charge. She had no lawyer, no public defender, no excuses. She simply said, "I'm ready to give my statement." And when they led her into the small gray room with the peeling paint and the broken ceiling fan, she didn't sit back. She leaned forward, then came the confession. "My name is Charlene Marie Carter. I was born April 2nd, 1975 in Charleston, South Carolina. I was a school counselor for 17 years. I had one child. Her name was Ayanna." She paused. Her voice didn't break. It didn't rise. She spoke like someone telling a story she had rehearsed in her bones. "I met Malcolm Bennett at church. He was quiet, gentle, good with my daughter, or so I thought. We married when Ayanna was 8. At first, everything was fine. Then she changed slowly. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things, less eye contact, more time alone with him. Then she stopped going to church, started locking her door. I chalked it up to adolescence. She folded her hands on the table, looked down, then up again. In 2010, they went sailing just like they always did. He said they'd be back Sunday night. They never returned. Coast Guard found the boat drifting. Life jackets gone. No storm, no bodies, no answers. I lit a candle every August 5th for 12 years. I kept their room the same. I never dated again. I buried them without coffins. But something inside me always said they weren't dead, not both. The officer taking the statement didn't interrupt. Then my friend Sandra went to Ecuador last month. She sent me a clip from a street celebration. I watched it once, then again, then frame by frame. I knew that laugh, that hand, that man, that girl. I enhanced the video. I froze it. It was them, older, different, but them. She paused again, steady. I booked a flight, flew there myself, spent 10 days watching them, listening, asking around without asking too much. The locals called them Miguel and Rosa. They taught, they smiled, they danced, they kissed, and no one knew they were father and daughter. Not anymore. She placed her hands flat on the table. They didn't drown that day. I did. I drowned when I realized they chose each other. I drowned when I realized they didn't need me to disappear. They just did it on their own. I bought the gun for $180. I don't know the man's name. I wrote a letter. I left it on the motel table. It said, "There's no fixing what's already dead." She leaned in close, voice firmer. I confronted them outside their home. I gave them a chance to speak, but there was nothing they could say that would unerase the last 12 years of my life. They lived, they loved, and I lit candles. One officer asked, "So, you shot them?" Charlene nodded. "Yes, one for each. He took my daughter. She helped him bury me. I didn't kill strangers. I killed the ghosts who haunted me every day since 2010. Then she added softly, "I know it was murder, but don't ask me if I'd take it back, because I finally stopped drowning." Charlene Carter entered the courtroom on September 12, 2022, wearing a plain gray jumpsuit and chains around her ankles. She didn't look around. She didn't search the crowd for faces. Her eyes were set forward the entire time, shoulders back, lips pressed tight. For 12 years she had moved through life as a shell. Now she was finally being seen again, but not as a grieving mother, not as a widow, as a defendant in a double homicide trial. The prosecution wasted no time shaping the narrative. To them, Charlene was cold, calculated, dangerous, a woman who crossed borders, stalked her targets, bought an illegal weapon, and executed 2 unarmed people in public. They played surveillance footage of her stepping from the shadows. They showed the receipt from the gun purchase. They held up the letter she left behind in her motel room, calling it a pre-written eulogy for lives she had no right to end. But the defense came armed with something harder to measure: time. They described 12 years of unanswered grief. A mother who lit candles for ghosts while the people she mourned shared meals in another country. They talked about betrayal, manipulation, secrecy, about the emotional pull between a stepfather and a child who had been pulled too close for too long. They didn't justify the act, but they wanted the court to understand the erosion behind it. They brought in a psychiatrist. He didn't speak like a man defending a client. He spoke like a man holding a broken object gently in his hands. This wasn't rage, he said plainly. This was erosion. Year after year, her identity was worn down, first by confusion, then by silence, then by a kind of grief that offered no closure. She lived for a memory that had betrayed her. She died quietly every day until one day she stopped letting it happen. He said the act wasn't a snap. It was a slow drip, a building, a point reached, not exploded. Charlene didn't take the stand, but her statement was read aloud. I am not proud of what I did, but I know why I did it. I know what it cost me, and I know what they took. Not just from me, but from the girl I raised. She didn't just disappear. She became someone else entirely. And I watched it all happen from the dark. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They came back with a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 30 years with the possibility of parole after 20. When the sentence was read, Charlene didn't cry. She stood still, blinked once, and whispered, "Thank you," to the judge. It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't drama. It was relief. There were no more questions, no more guessing, no more waiting for the dead to walk back through the door. But as the bailiff turned her toward the exit, a single tear slipped down Charlene's cheek. Not for the sentence, not for the time, but for the little girl in the blue dress who used to fall asleep in her lap after school. The child who once called her mommy in the dark and who later vanished into someone else's arms. That was who she wept for. And maybe on some level, that's who she had pulled the trigger for too. The home in Ecuador now stands empty. Curtains drawn, dishes still in the sink. Local authorities sealed it the day after the shooting. No one returned to claim anything. Not the photographs, not the boat keys, not even the clothes folded neatly in the bedroom. Locals passed by in silence. A few light candles on the front steps. A quiet ritual for people they never truly knew. To them, Miguel and Rosa were polite, reserved, kind. They taught English, smiled in the marketplace, danced at festivals, but no next of kin came forward. No embassy filed paperwork. No funeral arrangements were made. 2 names on a death certificate, but no one to read them out loud. In the end, their love died the way it lived, in hiding. Back in South Carolina, from inside a prison cell, Charlene picks up a pen. Her handwriting is even, clean, focused. She writes, "I mourned them once, I mourned them twice, but never again." She doesn't ask for forgiveness. She doesn't try to explain what's already been explained. She simply puts down the pen and finally, for the first time in 12 years, she sleeps. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was betrayal repackaged as tragedy. A mother erased, a daughter lost, and a man who turned protection into possession, who made love into something monstrous. They vanished into the sea, but they were never lost, only hiding in plain sight, hiding behind new names, new lives, and a silence that almost worked. But the sea doesn't keep secrets. It only delays them. If this story made you pause, share it. Would you have forgiven them? Would you have pulled the trigger? Comment your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for the next haunting episode.